Let's look for a moment at the history of the American Civil Rights Movement. Can you discuss what its origins were for African Americans and what its goals were?
The origins are, of course, long-standing grievances about unequal treatment. And that unequal treatment was both by law and by custom. What changed in the mid-20th century was a modern understanding of political organization and the use of religion to get some kind of moral leverage on the community. It became obvious after World War I and World War II that African American soldiers were necessary to win important military fights. But especially after World War II, the increase in communism and the Cold War's existence after 1945 created a propaganda problem for the United States. How can the United States ever talk about the freedom and the right to self-determination of other countries when we do not practice it ourselves? Communist propaganda certainly shed light on the rest of the world about American segregation. And it became very important not only to fulfill the promises of the Constitution, but for our national interest and security, to try to create a better image of the United States and treat our people the way we expect other countries to do the same.
Did the movement have a specific goal or goals?
Yes. The movement for civil rights was to fulfill the goals of the documents that already existed in the United States. This was not a revolution. The goal of the civil rights movement was not to rewrite the Constitution. It was not to recharter the Declaration of Independence. It was to fulfill the promises that already existed on paper and apply them to all members of the community.
What were the most prominent civil rights organizations back then, and what tactics did they use?
There were two main civil rights organizations in the African American community starting in the 1950s. There was the religious-based older generation known as the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This was the organization that included Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as its leader, as well as other prominent religious leaders in the Black South. The other main organization was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC, which was largely made up of college-age students and other community activists, mostly from the Black community, but also including a lot of white workers as well. The main differences were that the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, believed in civil disobedience and, as much as possible, not overtly breaking the law. Civil disobedience would include, for example, sitting at a lunch counter, but it would not include marching against the will of the governor. So, for example, you can break some of the laws. If you break the laws, you should accept the consequences, and that includes Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous letter from a Birmingham jail, where he accepted the consequences of civil disobedience. However, going overtly against an order, such as Governor Wallace's order in 1965 against marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge the second time, when the governor said you cannot march, King did not march, and he turned the group around, whereas SNCC was much more eager for absolutely upfront confrontation, going and agitating in the governor's mansion, near the governor, near other leaders, openly inviting police reaction. That was SNCC's idea of confrontation.
So the SCLC was mainly involved in violating laws which enforced racial discrimination, right?
Yes.
But they would not violate other laws. Is that fair?
Yes. And again, the younger activists were impatient, and they believed that Dr. King was being too deferential to the laws and to the leaders as they existed. Instead of agitating, he was waiting.
Can you discuss the significance of what Rosa Parks did?
Sure. So Rosa Parks is portrayed as a woman who is tired at the end of a long workday, but there, of course, is a much more complicated story about that. Even in Birmingham, there were other Black passengers who had tried to disobey the norms of the transportation system, but they were not considered quite the right face to the movement. So Rosa Parks was technically not the first African American who refused to move, but as a very dutiful member of the NAACP, she was part of the organized effort to bring attention to this area of segregation. So what she did was she was the right face to start a sympathetic movement, but also an economic one. So we have to remember that the tactics of the civil rights movement, both for SCLC and SNCC, including bringing attention to the economic ramifications of segregation. In short, the Birmingham bus system needed its black customers. The boycott was not just to make a social point, it was to make an economic point. That black contribution to the city was enormous.
So boycotts were another tactic.
Yes, so boycotts allowed the community, both political and economic, to see the impact of black residents in the community. And by withholding funds from a business or a publicly funded transportation system, we would get the fuller sense of black contributions to that community.